So I was channeling Jane Austen for some reason in trying to come up with a title for this talk. I tried flex and flexibility. That didn't seem to work. But sense, in the term that Austen used it, Connecticut is kind of, it's a state that doesn't have a great sense of humor. It's kind of a broad, a focused state, a kind of a down to earth state. But one thing, and so we're very prudent. I would say that I'm using sense in the sense of prudence, and also impact, transferability. Sensibility in the work is evokes emotion, but transferability is that kind of prudent kind of thing that makes prudence a good thing. And I just want to kind of talk a little bit about Connecticut's experience, when you look over your neighbor's side, the fence between you and your neighbor to see how they're doing the barbecue, you might pick up a few pointers, and this is kind of over the fence kind of talk, very brief. I just want to also say I'm a very poor substitute for Jim Igle from Massachusetts, who has worked with tax credits a lot longer than I have, and we basically adapted all of Jim's and Preservation Massachusetts program in many aspects. We've modeled ours after that. So you're hearing a little bit today about Massachusetts as well. Let me start with just, I know you guys are going to go out there into the field tomorrow and push talk with your legislators and push for changes to the program. And when I think of the tax credits program, the federal, the state, it's all about stewardship. I mean, the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 made stewardship of historic properties a federal policy for the first time ever. And it also moved it out of just a federally controlled property scene into the private sector. And most of the action in historic preservation since then has been in the private sector. And the tax credits, in my opinion, is the most effective stewardship tool that ever came along to reinforce the National Historic Preservation Act. So when you go out there, it's not just about economic development. Economic development is a great consequence of this, but ultimately, this is the only way you can get money into preservation projects. The National Historic Preservation Act recognized that there was a gap in funding for stewardship. That we're taking on these properties at a moment in their lives when they're in need of major work, they're obsolescent. They may be very historic, and they're obsolescent because they are historic, and they needed to breathe new life. And the Act anticipated that there would be federal grant money for doing this, for accomplishing that gap, for making up the gap that you would need to get these buildings back into good shape. Well, this is just a matrix of the track record of grant funding from 1967 to the birth of the historic rehabilitation tax credit. And you can see that even though the authorization would be there for $2 million or $2 billion, nothing of that size was ever getting actually out on the street. And so it was kind of, after 20 years of failure of really moving the money out onto the street, it was really great that someone sat down and rethought the system and brought tax credits into the mix. And tax credits have accomplished way beyond what anybody probably reasonably expected from the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. So that should be your, when you're talking to legislators tomorrow, and they understand environmental stewardship, and they might even understand religious stewardship. You can feel free to say that this is a great stewardship vehicle, and we're doing this because of stewardship, and it creates economic development. So let me turn now to the state. We're about a year younger than you are with our current day tax credits, and we started in 2008 with the current system. To be eligible for the state tax credit, you have to be on the state or national register. Now, New York State doesn't have a state register, doesn't have a separate state register. But Connecticut does, and that's a really great tool right there, because the standards are slightly lower to get a property on the register in terms of the cost of registration, the amount of research you need to do, and the amount of time that it takes to get the property on. The Park Services and the National Park Services are included in that. It's all done internally within the State Historic Preservation Office. So properties that are listed on the state register are eligible for state tax credits. Properties that are listed on the national register are eligible for federal and state tax credits. Obviously, the work in both cases needs to be compliant with the Secretary of Interior standards. Our eligibility for state tax credits is that it can be residential with 5 or more units. So it builds in something for multiple housing. It can be mixed residential and commercial, or it can be 100% non-residential. So it's a pretty lenient way of inclusiveness. It's a 25% tax credit on qualified rehabilitation expenditures, and it's a 30% if you meet the criteria for what the state considers affordable housing, and that's a variable criteria depending on the size of the property. So it's a pretty good bang for your buck. Our issues that we lobby with each year is that it is limited. The cap of the amount of tax credits that are authorized each year is limited at $31.7 million, which we have found is usually oversubscribed by the second fiscal quarter of the fiscal year. So they start moving. It's a simple process in Connecticut to get authorization for the next year. You just have to get authorization from the Comptroller's office. But 2 years ago, we were a year and a half ahead in the fiscal year. They were authorizing state tax credits, and that's just a crazy way to do things. There was clearly a bigger demand for the state tax credits than the cap was allowing. And it's also capped at $4.5 million total tax credit value per project phase. It allows for phasing of projects. So in an industrial building where you have like maybe 3 sections that are divided by a firewall, by 2 firewalls, you can go back to the well 3 times for separate appropriations. You can do that in the same fiscal year as long as they have the different addresses. State tax credits in Connecticut are independent of the federal tax credit. Yours are yoked, and that's a real problem here, and you're trying to address that with this. So I want to just talk a little bit about the benefits of having an uncoupled tax credit. First, the tax credits are reserved upon SHPO approval only. The Park Service isn't involved with any of the tax credit review, so it can be a much quicker, expedited process when it works well. The tax credits are transferable to the state has a list of qualified C corporations under IRS regs, the tax credits are awarded on a voucher system. So basically how this works is that there are corporations in Connecticut that owe much more taxes to the government than they want to pay to the government. And so in lieu of paying those taxes, those corporations could put money directly back into the local communities by basically paying for the tax credit directly to the developer, the owner of the developer. And one of the weaknesses of this process is that the state tax credits are subject to federal taxation. So you don't get the full dollar value. But we have corporations in Connecticut that are paying dollar for dollar. Now, not all the corporations, C corporations, pay dollar for dollar for the voucher. So you go through a 5-part application process. The last part of that application process is the release of voucher form, where the SHPO says this project has been completed as we understood from the very beginning, from the part 2 of the process. And we recommend the voucher. The voucher comes from the controller's office, and then the owner, the development entity, takes the voucher, takes that to the C Corporation, says, C Corporation, here's our voucher. They cut a check, and the money comes directly. It's a very, very quick process. It can take 48 hours sometimes in terms of turning it around. So it's really clean, and it's very popular, and it's a lot less paperwork, and it works in Connecticut. To date, the state tax credits have been used in 59 resources. Now that is probably a laughably small number, but remember, we're kind of a small state next door. But that is the result of 85 vouchers. So the 85 vouchers are all those phased projects where, for example, some of the big mill projects in Connecticut have had 6 or 7 different vouchers for aggregating state tax credits under one general project. The total vouchers awarded so far for qualified rehabilitation for the percentage is $120 million. The QREs for that money leverage is $491 million. And the scale of the QREs, the qualified rehabilitation expenses, is really wonderful. And that's another objective you're trying to obtain in New York State. The smallest project awarded to date in terms of the qualified rehabilitation expenses is $229,000. So the total project cost of that was probably another 10 or 20% more than that. But that's something that a lot of small Main Street projects work at a scale at. And then the largest was 16.5, and that's one of those phased projects that had 5 different vouchers. So to get the biggest bang for the buck, Preservation Massachusetts, and subsequently, I believe Maine is doing it and Connecticut is doing it, developed an instrument called, what we call in Connecticut, a historic rehabilitation tax credit loan. And that brings the nonprofit, the statewide nonprofit entity, into the mix. So we joined the development team, or the Connecticut Trust joins the development team as a nonprofit entity. The trust receives the voucher. The voucher is given to the trust, which cleanses it of federal tax liability, takes the voucher, deposits it in the trust account, and then moves the money as a loan, as a forgivable loan, back to the development team, and without any expectation of the loan ever being repaid. This was a hiccup. I mean, when tax credits were created, they weren't created as to generate new tax revenue for the federal government. They were generated to accomplish stewardship. So we see this as core to the preservation mission of our state law. The trust, in turn, gets a very small percentage of that for the services of doing that. And that so far, the fees that we've done and the projects that we've done, 8 have been completed and 4 are under contract right now, has been about $515,000, which is pretty good. That supports our technical services program to a large degree and a lot of our staff costs. And I just want to give you a taste of a couple of the projects at different scale here. This is a great project that took 13 years to develop. It's in Vernon, Connecticut, which is a town about the same distance as Cohoes is from Albany. It's an industrial village in a former behemoth of a wool-making community, a lot of woolen mills. This was the former Roosevelt Mills. It's a 1906, very early reinforced concrete mill building, a very unusual one. By 1970s, the mill had gone out. It was vacant, but structurally undamaged until 2003, when the town said enough is enough, we want to demolish it. An architect, rushed in and bought the building with the hopes of getting the development going. He stuck through it. Joe Valone stuck through this process for 13 years, through the crash, when he was holding this building. There were just about every issue that you imagine with the preservation project was present here. Floodplain issues, hazardous materials, site contamination, you name it. Let alone that it was a really risky investment in a kind of a depressed woolen community, former woolen community. By 2015, he had the site issues resolved. He found a developer, Mark Levine, and in 2016, 1 year, they converted this to lofts. The state tax credit was absolutely critical to the stewardship of this building. This was a building that Connecticut did not want to lose, but without the state tax credit, the federal tax credits, we have LIHTC and Connecticut's affordable housing tax credits in there too. But without those enhancements, the stewardship of this property would have never happened. At the other end of the spectrum is a more of a mom and pop kind of project. Two neighbors of this Victorian house didn't want to see it torn down. The building had been a private residence built in the 1880s. In the 1950s, it was converted to a Ukrainian Catholic girls' school. They operated the school for about 15 years, and then the sisters basically seemed to have gotten forgotten by the diocese, which was based in Philadelphia. The school was closed. They kind of kept the building in good repair. They lived in the building, and they just aged out. They were in their 90s, and the diocese said, okay, we're moving you all into a nursing home. We're going to sell the property. In Stamford, a very hot real estate market. This was a white elephant. So the neighborhood association said, can we get this on the National Register? And it was felt by our SHPO that the building wasn't registered for, wasn't qualified as a single landmark for an individual listing on the National Register. So they went through a 3-year process of getting the entire neighborhood put on the register. So this would be a contributing element, and they would get it in. So when developers started eyeing this and coming up with proposals for developing it with units of 5 new single-family houses on the site, these two neighbors rushed in, and the state tax credit was absolutely essential for them to accomplish the save of this building. There was, the trust helped them out making the case because it had been adapted to a school, and all they wanted to do was bring it up to code for contemporary schools. It was up to code for a 1957 school. It wasn't up to code for a 2016 school. So they had to put in an elevator. They had to replace a couple of staircases interior, but they did it all within following the Secretary of the Interior standards, and they got the state tax credit. So the total project cost on this was $1.7 million, which was mostly for the elevator and the stair work and some roof work. And they got tax credits of $381,000 for the state tax credits. So it was a pretty flexible instrument. And I know that that's also an objective. You're trying to get the federal tax credit or tax credits at least down to Main Street, and uncoupled, transferable state tax credit is the way to go. So if you want more information on the state tax credit, not that you're going to be able to use this for tomorrow, but maybe just some numbers you want. If your legislators have questions about who we could talk to in Connecticut who knows something about this. At the Connecticut Trust, the guy in the lower photograph is Brad Scheid, a former colleague of mine. Really great guy, and knows how to bend these tax credits, 50 ways around an obstacle. And so his phone number is 860-463-0193. And Brad can answer questions about the tax credit loans. Julie Carmelic at SHPO is the tax credit coordinator, and she can talk to you about the state tax credits. That's it for me. Thanks.